Now, this is Adnan Syed. He's 41 years old. He's spent more than half of his life in jail. Well, now prosecutors in the US have dropped all charges against him, and he's been cleared of the murder of his former girlfriend. His case gave rise to the true crime podcast Serial. That was followed by hundreds of millions of people. Adnan Syed was jailed at the age of 19 and always maintained his innocence. But it was the podcast which created the catalyst, ultimately, for his release. Vinoo Varghese is a Wall Street criminal defence attorney and former prosecutor, and I asked him why this had come about now.
Well, what came is basically a change in administration in Baltimore and a unit that was there to investigate potential wrongful convictions. But this all started because of the podcast. I mean, the podcast, as you just said, drew international attention to this case. But for that podcast, and then the subsequent HBO documentary, which basically replayed the podcast, a lot of people would not have known about this. And it's the change, it's that podcast and basically that one, as well as the Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, that has shed light or put sunlight upon prosecutors and law enforcement in a way that it's never been done before, because TV shows like Law and Order make prosecutors to be these holy, godlike warriors. And so while I'm a former prosecutor, I've been a defense attorney nearly half of my life, and this is a good thing that has come about. There was DNA evidence that finally was tested, that could have been tested a long time ago, that Syed's DNA was not on her clothing. And in fact, there was DNA from 4 other people.
So these are details, Vinoo, sorry to interrupt you, that actually
Sure.
300 odd million people who downloaded this podcast know, and far better than I do. I haven't followed the podcast, but they presumably learned about all this unreliable evidence through the podcast, which was then taken into the courtroom. So that's the sort of direction of travel here.
But they lost in the courtroom. That's the important thing to understand, that the state of Maryland's highest court, the Court of Appeals, rejected arguments put forth. Now, amazingly, but not surprisingly, I say amazingly from the perspective of a layman, but not surprisingly from the perspective of a lawyer, the high court found that Syed's lawyer at trial was incompetent, but basically that he had waived certain claims by not raising them earlier. She was incompetent because she failed to examine an alibi witness, but they said the guilt was overwhelming against him, and that Syed waived his claim that cell tower evidence was faulty and could not have properly linked him to this case.
So
they found that, but they excused all that, and they excused prosecutors because in this country, a jury verdict is considered sacrosanct. It's holy. It's not to be disturbed unless something extraordinary.
Let me ask you.
Did not find this extraordinary.
Let me ask you, Vinoo, then, how frequent do you think these sorts of miscarriages, if I can put it, of justice are? I mean, is this a major, widespread, fundamental problem in the States, or are these just one-offs?
I think it is a major problem. I've seen it. There are too many stories of this that do not get reversed because basically procedural roadblocks are put in place to prevent appellate courts from looking at the things that could clear somebody. But but for this podcast casting light on this, and again, notwithstanding the podcast, Syed lost in court. It was with the change of administration and the finally re-examining or examining DNA evidence that cleared him. And now the state's attorney, the local Baltimore prosecutor, is going to file a motion to say he's innocent.
Vinoo Varghese was talking to me from New York.